He sold the Eiffel Tower. Then he sold it again. He convinced one of the most feared gangsters in America, Al Capone, to hand him thousands of dollars. And he built a machine that appeared to print money. For years, bankers, businessmen, investors, criminals, and even government officials fell for his schemes. Not because they were stupid, because Victor Lustig understood something most people never learn. The easiest person to deceive is someone who believes they cannot be deceived. Paris, 1925. A wealthy scrap metal dealer sits inside one of the city's most luxurious hotels. Across the table sits a senior government official. At least that's who he appears to be. The official explains that the French government has reached a difficult decision. The Eiffel Tower is too expensive to maintain. It will be sold for scrap. The businessman can hardly believe his luck. The opportunity is worth a fortune. The documents look authentic. The meeting feels official. Everything appears legitimate. But there is one problem. The government official isn't a government official. The documents are fake. The sale is fake. And by the time the businessman realizes it, Victor Lustig is already gone. This is the story of the man many consider the greatest conman who ever lived. The man who sold the Eiffel Tower. Twice. He sold the Eiffel Tower. Twice. Paris, 1925. The city was still recovering from the scars of war. The Great War had ended only a few years earlier. Millions were dead. Governments were rebuilding. Economies were struggling to find their footing. And in the middle of it all stood one of the most recognizable structures on Earth. The Eiffel Tower. Today it is untouchable, a global icon, a symbol of France itself. But in 1925, many Parisians hated it. Newspapers complained about maintenance costs. Politicians debated its future. Critics called it an ugly relic. And somewhere in the city, a man was reading those articles very carefully. His name was Victor Lustig. And he had just discovered what might be the greatest scam in history. A few weeks later, 6 wealthy scrap metal dealers received an invitation. The invitation appeared official, confidential, government business. The meeting would take place at the luxurious Hôtel de Crillon. There, an important government official would discuss a highly sensitive matter, the demolition of the Eiffel Tower. The dealers arrived intrigued, nervous, excited. The man waiting for them looked exactly like a government bureaucrat should. Well-dressed, professional, polite. He carried official documents, official stamps, official authority. Everything appeared legitimate. The dealers listened carefully. The French government, he explained, had quietly decided that maintaining the Eiffel Tower had become too expensive. The structure would be sold for scrap. The contract would go to the right bidder. And because of political sensitivity, everything had to remain secret. The businessmen could hardly believe their luck. One of them was especially eager. A man desperate to prove himself among Paris's elite businessmen. A man eager to seize the opportunity of a lifetime. Victor Lustig noticed immediately. Because he always noticed. A few days later, that businessman handed over a fortune, and Victor Lustig disappeared. The buyer had not purchased the Eiffel Tower, he had purchased a lie, and the most unbelievable part, Victor Lustig would return and try the same scam again. This is the story of the man who sold the Eiffel Tower twice, and the uncomfortable truth that intelligent people are often the easiest people to fool. History remembers conquerors, generals, kings, revolutionaries, people who changed the world through force. Victor Lustig changed lives without firing a shot. He carried no army, ruled no country, commanded no fleet. Yet he managed to steal millions from some of the smartest people of his era. Bankers, businessmen, investors, criminals, even government officials. To understand how he did it, we need to understand something about human nature. Most people think scams work because victims are stupid. History suggests otherwise. The best scams succeed because victims are human. They exploit ambition, greed, status, fear, hope, the same emotions that drive ordinary people every single day. Victor Lustig understood this better than almost anyone who ever lived. That understanding would make him rich, famous, wanted, and eventually hunted across continents. But before he became the greatest conman of the 20th century, he was just a boy from a small town in Europe. A boy nobody expected to become anything extraordinary. Chapter 1. The Boy Nobody Noticed. Victor Lustig was born in 1890 in what is now the Czech Republic. At the time, the region formed part of the vast Austro-Hungarian Empire. Like many future legends, his origins were surprisingly ordinary. No great wealth, no noble title, no obvious sign that history would remember his name. But from an early age, Victor possessed a gift. Not for mathematics, not for business, not for warfare. For people. Some individuals seem able to walk into a room and immediately understand its social dynamics. Who feels insecure? Who wants attention? Who craves approval? Who needs to feel important? Victor appeared to possess this ability in abundance. He studied people the way scientists study experiments. Quietly, patiently, constantly. While others focused on facts, Victor focused on emotions. Because facts can be checked, emotions cannot. As a young man, he developed another valuable skill: languages. He reportedly learned several: German, French, Czech, English, and others. This ability allowed him to move effortlessly between social circles. More importantly, it allowed him to become whoever he needed to be. A businessman, an aristocrat, a diplomat, an investor, a government official. Most people reveal their identity through speech. Victor learned how to construct identities through speech. That distinction would become the foundation of his career. By his 20s, he was traveling across Europe. Luxury trains became his classroom. Hotels became his workplace. And wealthy passengers became his opportunities. Because Victor had discovered something few people understand. Trust is often given long before it is earned. All it takes is the right appearance, the right confidence, the right story. And if anyone embodied that principle, it was Victor Lustig. The train passenger. Imagine boarding a luxury train crossing Europe. The year is 1912. You settle into your compartment. Across from you sits an elegant gentleman. Well-dressed, well-spoken, educated, refined. He introduces himself politely. The conversation flows effortlessly. Hours pass. You discuss politics, business, travel. By the time the train reaches its destination, you feel as though you've made a valuable connection. Perhaps even a friend. What you don't realize is that every word was part of an evaluation. Victor wasn't trying to impress you. He was studying you, your ambitions, your fears, your weaknesses. And if he decided you were useful, you might soon become his next opportunity. Most con men begin with small scams. Victor was no different. But unlike ordinary criminals, he wasn't interested in quick money. He was interested in mastering the craft, and mastery requires practice. Lots of it. Chapter 2. The Apprentice Conman. The world before the First World War was full of opportunity. Borders were easier to cross, identities were easier to invent, records were harder to verify. A skilled liar could travel hundreds of miles before anyone discovered the truth. Victor thrived in this environment. He experimented constantly. Different identities, different accents, different stories. Some scams succeeded, others failed, but each one taught him something valuable. Most criminals focus on stealing money. Victor focused on understanding trust. Why do people believe strangers? Why do people ignore warning signs? Why do intelligent individuals make irrational decisions? The answers fascinated him, and over time his methods became increasingly sophisticated. He learned that confidence matters more than detail. People rarely question someone who appears certain. He learned that status creates shortcuts in the human brain. Expensive clothes, luxury hotels, exclusive invitations. These things make people lower their guard. Most importantly, he learned that people desperately want to believe they are special. Give someone access to an opportunity nobody else has. Tell them they have been chosen. Make them feel important, and they will often ignore obvious dangers. Victor would spend the rest of his life exploiting that truth. Not because he hated people, but because he understood them, perhaps better than they understood themselves. By now, Victor could become almost anyone. The challenge was no longer creating identities, the challenge was deciding which identity to become. And soon he would discover the role he was born to play. Chapter 3. The Art of Becoming Anyone. Most people think conmen are liars. Victor Lustig would have disagreed, because lying is actually a small part of the job. The real skill is believability. Anyone can tell a lie. Very few people can make a lie feel true. Victor understood that successful deception is never about information. It is about emotion. People don't buy facts, they buy certainty. A fake aristocrat doesn't convince people because his story is perfect. He convinces people because he behaves exactly the way they expect an aristocrat to behave. A fake banker succeeds because he looks successful. A fake official succeeds because he appears authoritative. Victor became a master of this principle. He studied clothing, manners, speech patterns, body language, everything. He could walk into a room filled with wealthy businessmen and instantly become one of them. Not because he belonged there, because nobody could imagine that he didn't. This was his true superpower, not fraud, transformation. And by the early 1920s, all those years of practice had created something dangerous. A man capable of convincing almost anyone of almost anything. All he needed was the right opportunity. Then, in 1925, he opened a newspaper and found it, an article about the Eiffel Tower, a maintenance problem, a political controversy, a public debate. Most readers forgot the article within minutes. Victor Lustig saw a fortune, and what happened next would become one of the most famous scams in history. The man who could become anyone was about to become a government official, and Paris was about to become his stage. Chapter 4. Selling the Eiffel Tower. The opportunity arrived disguised as a newspaper article. Most people saw a maintenance problem. Victor Lustig saw a fortune. In 1925, newspapers discussed the enormous costs associated with maintaining the Eiffel Tower. The structure was aging, repairs were expensive. Critics continued arguing that it should never have been built in the first place. To Victor, the article revealed something important. The story was believable. And in the world of confidence tricks, believability is everything. Within days, he began preparing. Official government stationery was forged. Documents were created, titles were invented. Victor transformed himself into a senior official from the French Ministry of Posts and Telegraphs. Then he selected his targets. Not random businessmen, scrap metal dealers, men whose fortunes depended on buying and selling large quantities of metal, men who would immediately understand the value of dismantling the Eiffel Tower. 6 invitations were sent, each marked confidential, each designed to make the recipient feel special, chosen, important. The bait worked perfectly. The businessmen arrived at the luxurious Hôtel de Crillon. The setting itself was part of the scam. Powerful people meet in prestigious places. Victor understood this instinctively. The men entered expecting government business. Victor greeted them as a government official, calm, professional, confident, the perfect bureaucrat. Then he revealed the secret. The French government had quietly decided to sell the Eiffel Tower for scrap. Political sensitivities required absolute discretion. Public outrage would be enormous. Therefore, only a select group of trusted dealers had been invited. The businessmen listened in disbelief. The opportunity sounded impossible, but everything around them suggested legitimacy. The documents, the hotel, the official language, the confidence, and most importantly, their own desire to believe. Because if the story were true, the profits would be enormous. The perfect victim. Among the 6 men was a dealer named André Poisson. Poisson desperately wanted acceptance among Paris's business elite. He was successful, but he still felt like an outsider. Victor recognized this immediately. The greatest con men don't look for greed first, they look for insecurity. Insecurity is easier to manipulate. Poisson wanted to prove himself. Victor gave him the chance, or at least the illusion of one. But Victor wasn't finished. The sale itself was only half the scam. The real masterpiece came next. Chapter 5. The Bribe. Victor understood something about bureaucracy. People often assume corruption exists, especially around large government contracts. So he decided to use that assumption. After meeting privately with Poisson, Victor hinted at a problem. Government officials, he suggested, were not always well compensated. Perhaps a personal incentive might help move the contract forward. It was brilliant, because it solved the victim's final doubts. A corrupt official felt more believable than an honest one. Poisson interpreted the request as proof that the deal was real. Why would a scammer ask for a bribe? A scammer would simply take the money. A corrupt official, however, would ask exactly what Victor had asked. The logic felt sound, so Poisson paid. He paid for the contract, he paid the bribe, and he handed Victor a fortune. Then Victor disappeared. By the time the truth emerged, he was already leaving France. Poisson was devastated. Not only had he lost a fortune, he had been humiliated. And humiliation creates silence. Poisson feared becoming a laughingstock. So he did something unexpected. He didn't immediately report the crime, which was exactly what Victor had hoped. The conman escaped because the victim was too embarrassed to admit he had been fooled. For Victor, it was the perfect ending. Or it should have been. Most criminals would have celebrated. Most criminals would have retired. Victor Lustig did something far stranger. He looked at Paris and decided to do it again. Only a conman operating on a completely different level could pull off the sale of the Eiffel Tower. Only Victor Lustig would consider repeating it. Chapter 6. Returning to the crime scene. The safest move was to disappear. Victor knew that. Any rational criminal would leave Europe with the money and never look back. But Victor wasn't motivated solely by money, he was motivated by mastery. The scam had worked so perfectly that he became curious. Could it work twice? The question itself reveals something important about his psychology. Many criminals steal because they need money. Victor increasingly behaved like a gambler. The money mattered. But proving he could win mattered more. So he returned to Paris. He created a new list of targets, prepared new documents, constructed a new identity, and began setting the stage once again. The Eiffel Tower was still standing. The government still owned it. The entire story remained absurd. Yet remarkably, some people were willing to believe it. History becomes blurry here. Most accounts agree that Victor began a second attempt, but this time something changed. One of the targets became suspicious. Questions were asked, doubts emerged, the risk increased rapidly. Victor sensed danger immediately. Great conmen survive because they know when to leave. He abandoned the operation and fled before authorities could close in. Once again, he escaped. Once again, he vanished. But now something had changed. Europe was becoming more dangerous. His reputation was growing. Police were becoming more interested. New opportunities awaited across the Atlantic. And soon Victor Lustig would arrive in the perfect environment for a man like him. America. A country overflowing with ambition, wealth, optimism, and people convinced they were too smart to be fooled. They were exactly the kind of people Victor liked best. In Paris, Victor Lustig had sold a landmark. In America, he would sell something even more valuable. Trust itself. And among his future targets would be bankers, millionaires, and perhaps the most feared gangster in the world, Al Capone. Chapter 7. America, the perfect hunting ground. When Victor Lustig arrived in America, he found exactly what he had been looking for, a country obsessed with success. The 1920s were roaring, money flowed through Wall Street, skyscrapers rose into the sky, fortunes appeared overnight. Everywhere people searched for the next opportunity, the next investment, the next shortcut to wealth. And where ambition thrives, confidence men thrive alongside it. Victor understood something fundamental about the American dream. People wanted to believe, not because they were foolish, because hope is powerful. A man promising impossible returns wasn't always rejected. Sometimes he was celebrated. America was full of individuals convinced they were smarter than everyone else. Victor loved people like that, because the easiest people to fool are often the ones who believe they cannot be fooled. He moved effortlessly through wealthy circles, luxury hotels, private clubs, business gatherings. Every room contained potential. Every conversation offered information. And every ambitious businessman carried vulnerabilities waiting to be discovered. By now, Victor had refined his craft to near perfection. He no longer relied solely on lies. He relied on psychology. The victim would often convince themselves. Victor simply provided the opportunity. And nowhere would that become clearer than in one of his most famous encounters, a meeting with America's most feared gangster. Most criminals avoided Al Capone. Victor Lustig saw a business opportunity. Chapter 8. The Man Who Conned Al Capone. In Chicago, one name inspired fear above all others: Al Capone, the king of organized crime, a man surrounded by violence, power, and money. A man few people dared deceive. Victor decided to try. The plan was surprisingly simple. He approached Capone with an investment proposal. The details hardly mattered. What mattered was the amount: $50,000, an enormous sum at the time. Capone agreed. The money was handed over. Most people expected Victor to disappear immediately. That would have been the obvious scam. Victor had something more sophisticated in mind. He placed the money in a safe deposit box and left it untouched. Months passed. Then Victor returned. He appeared disappointed, ashamed. The investment had failed. The money, however, remained intact. Victor handed back every dollar. Capone was stunned. This was not how criminals behaved. This was not how conmen behaved. The gesture appeared honest, respectable, trustworthy. Capone, impressed by what seemed like integrity, reportedly rewarded Victor with several $1,000s. That reward had been Victor's objective from the beginning. He never intended to steal the $50,000. He intended to sell trust. And trust, it turned out, could be even more profitable. The gangster. Imagine being one of Capone's associates. You hear about a stranger who approached the boss, a stranger who walked away alive. Then you hear something even stranger. The man gave the money back. The room falls silent. Nobody understands. Why refuse $50,000? The answer reveals everything about Victor Lustig. Most thieves think about today's score. Victor thought about tomorrow's opportunity. That mindset separated him from ordinary criminals. By now, Victor had mastered confidence, but he wasn't finished. His most profitable operation was still ahead. And unlike the Eiffel Tower scam, this one would attract the attention of the federal government. Chapter 9. The Money Machine. Of all Victor Lustig's scams, one stood above the rest. Not because it was the most complicated, because it was almost laughably simple. He called it a money box. At first glance, the machine appeared impressive. Metal casing, mechanical components, complex design. It looked like something an inventor might create. Victor demonstrated it carefully. A genuine banknote was inserted. The machine rattled and clicked. Several hours later, another genuine banknote emerged. The machine appeared to duplicate money. Potential victims watched in amazement. Victor remained calm, patient, professional. He explained that the machine required time, several hours per note, an imperfect process, but profitable. The secret, of course, was hidden inside. The machine already contained genuine bills. It wasn't creating money, it was dispensing money Victor had placed there earlier. The trick bought him time. By the time victims realized the machine had stopped working, Victor was long gone. What made the scam brilliant was not the device itself, it was the victim's greed. People wanted to believe. They wanted access to a secret nobody else possessed. They wanted an unfair advantage. Victor simply gave them permission to deceive themselves. The machine became one of his most successful scams. But success creates attention, and attention creates problems, especially when counterfeit money enters the story. For years, Victor had manipulated perception. Now he would move into something even more dangerous: counterfeiting, and the consequences would finally begin catching up with him. Chapter 10. The FBI closes in. By the 1930s, Victor Lustig had evolved beyond simple confidence schemes. Authorities increasingly linked him to counterfeit operations. Fake currency began appearing across the United States. Investigators followed leads. Patterns emerged. Names surfaced, and eventually one name appeared repeatedly: Victor Lustig, the charming gentleman, the elegant businessman, the master manipulator. For years he had stayed one step ahead, changing identities, changing cities, changing stories. But the world was changing too. Law enforcement was becoming more sophisticated. Communication improved. Records improved. The same skills that allowed governments to grow stronger also made life harder for criminals. The net slowly tightened. Then came the mistake. Every great conman eventually makes one. A trusted associate became an informant. Information reached investigators. Suddenly, the man who had spent decades studying everyone else found himself being studied. The hunter became the hunted. Federal agents tracked him relentlessly. Cities that once offered anonymity now felt dangerous. Hotels became risks. Train stations became risks. Every stranger became a potential threat. For perhaps the first time in his life, Victor experienced something he had spent decades creating in others: uncertainty. Eventually, authorities caught him. The man who sold the Eiffel Tower. The man who fooled millionaires. The man who manipulated gangsters. The man who convinced victims to deceive themselves. His extraordinary career was finally over. History often portrays conmen as magicians, masters of deception, people capable of bending reality. But Victor Lustig's greatest lesson is far less comforting. He didn't succeed because he was magical. He succeeded because he understood human nature. He understood that people see what they want to see. Investors see profits. Politicians see opportunity. Businessmen see status. Dreamers see shortcuts. And once someone becomes emotionally invested in a belief, facts become surprisingly weak opponents. Victor Lustig never invented greed. He never invented ambition. He never invented ego. He simply learned how to recognize them. Then he built his entire career around them. That is why his story remains relevant nearly a century later. The technology changes. The scams change. The world changes. Human nature rarely does. Today, the victims may receive emails instead of letters. They may invest through apps instead of hotel meetings. They may lose cryptocurrency instead of cash. But the underlying psychology remains remarkably similar. The promise of exclusive knowledge. The promise of easy money. The promise of becoming special. Victor understood that promise better than almost anyone. Was he a criminal? Absolutely. Was he intelligent? Undeniably. Was he a villain? Perhaps, but like many anti-heroes, the answer isn't entirely simple, because Victor Lustig didn't conquer nations. He didn't command armies. He didn't change history through force. He held up a mirror. And what he revealed was not the weakness of his victims, but the weakness that exists inside all of us. The desire to believe, the desire to win, the desire to think we're too smart to be fooled. And that may have been his greatest trick of all: to convince intelligent people that intelligence alone could protect them. History is full of people like Victor Lustig, figures who operated in the shadows, manipulated systems, and forced the world to pay attention. If you enjoy exploring the minds, motives, and strategies of history's most fascinating anti-heroes, consider subscribing and tell us in the comments, who should we examine next? Until next time.